The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress. The veteran's name is Joe Mullens. He was born on December 5th, 1931. He served in the U.S. Navy. He achieved the rank of Lieutenant Junior Grade. We are reporting this on January 21st, 2012. I'm Daniel Mack, and I'm conducting the interview, no relation. Mr. Mullens, would you tell me about growing up where you did? Where you grew up, and just what it was like growing up in the Great Depression.
I grew up in the Great Depression, and my father, who was a veteran of World War I, went into the drugstore business, and he also sold appliances such as refrigerators. So my first remembrance of most of this was the fact that I played hide and seek in all of the appliances that had been returned from people not being able to pay for them. So he went into deep debt and later recovered when the World War II started, because then people started having jobs. And so my recollection was of the Depression was a huge amount of refrigerators that had been returned to my father. So after that, things went pretty well. I mean, my father also bought a farm, and I grew up in the summers working on the farm, and nothing much happened until I got out of high school and went to Emory at Oxford Junior College. And from there, I got in, during the summer, I went into the Navy Reserve and subsequently got a scholarship to attend Georgia Tech.
Now, you would have been, your 10th birthday would have been 2 days before Pearl Harbor. Do you remember first hearing about Pearl Harbor being bombed, or?
I remember basically when it happened, but I don't remember any specific thing that was brought to my attention other than I knew that we had been attacked and so forth. But it really had nothing to do with me going into the Navy.
So, no effect. What would you say did impact you choosing the Navy specifically?
I was looking for a summer job, and one of my classmates at Emory at Oxford said there was a program to get into the Navy Reserve and be able to make some money during the summer.
Were you expecting at that point in time, since there had just been a World War, to ever have there would be a war during your service, or conflict during your service?
The Korean conflict began after I got into the Navy Reserve, if I remember correctly, and but I was being in the Navy. I wasn't too worried about the Korean conflict because it was not much happening at sea. It was all, of course, a very tragic. It wasn't a war, it was a conflict. It seems to be that now you never have a declaration of war, you just have a conflict, which I disapprove of. That if it's not worth declaring war, then we ought not be fighting in it.
Now, you said you got your scholarship and you went to Georgia Tech. What happened? How long were you at Georgia Tech?
It was a 4-year scholarship, which meant I got partway into graduate school because I'd already served some time at Emory at Oxford. So I got partway through a master's degree and decided I would take the PhD exams to see how I would do. And I passed them so that when I got out of the Navy, I went back to grad school, finished up my master's, and started working on a PhD.
And what was your degrees in?
Chemical engineering. Had a BS, MS, and PhD in chem engineering.
Well, from Georgia Tech, that's pretty respectable.
Yeah, well, it was. I kind of went with the flow. As I passed something, I'd try for the next one, and so then I finally got through with my PhD. But I was very fortunate that doing working on my PhD, I worked as a graduate assistant for the Engineering Experiment Station in Georgia Tech. And so that the time I was working on my PhD counted later toward my retirement in the Clemson retirement program. I was very fortunate, so that I have 38 years in when I retired.
So when did you go to supply school for the Navy?
Why did I go?
Oh, or when? You went to Oxford, Emory, and then...
I went to supply school in 1950, I can't remember exactly what the dates were. There would be.
Were you pulled out of Emory, Oxford when the Korean War started?
No, I knew that I was going to go in, but I wasn't pulled out of anything. I got out of, and I'm getting confused.
Just go back, just talk about your time in the reserves. When you first signed up. You signed up in, you said 1949?
I believe that's about right for the reserves.
What was, I guess, what did you have daily, where were you when you were doing the reserves? What did that?
I was in Atlanta, Georgia. At that time there was an air station, and there was a unit. There was about 100 of us taken into the reserves at the airfield, Naval Air Station in Buckhead, just outside of Atlanta.
How big was the, I guess, the station in general? You said there was 100 people in the reserves, but was that as big as the station was, or?
That's all that was there in this summer program that they had for people who were in college, basically.
What about when it wasn't summer?
It was an air station.
Do you remember anything about that training in general? About any, I guess, drill sergeants that would have stood out? Or?
It was just a basic Navy enlisted man's training. If you went into the Navy as an enlisted man and then you were stationed at Great Lakes or someplace like that, it would be exactly the same program.
And you were doing this on the weekends while going to Oxford Emory?
No.
Or?
I did it during the summer.
Excuse me.
And then after I went back, I went to Georgia Tech. And
think you mentioned earlier you were a year into Georgia Tech, or?
Wait a minute. I left out something a little bit. When I first went to Georgia Tech, that was after 1 year at Emory at Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went to Georgia Tech, and I got into the co-op program. And actually, I went and worked for 1/4 of Georgia Tech. I worked at Tennessee Products Chemical Corporation as a co-op. Then came back, and I got a scholarship, and so that I quit co-oping, and went straight through Georgia Tech. That's what happened. It's kind of confusing because of the fact that I was a co-op for one work period.
But you would have gotten your officer's commission and gone to supply school when you were, I guess, after graduating Georgia Tech, because you would have needed the degree to be an officer.
After I was at Georgia Tech for 4 years, I got and that's why I worked partly on my master's. And I got a degree in 1955. Got my BS degree. But I had also completed some master's courses. Now what else do we have?
You told me you became a supply officer. I imagine that would have to been after you got it.
When I graduated from the program at Georgia Tech, I got shipped immediately to the supply school in Athens. And I know that's correct. And so I stayed there till the end of the summer. And then I joined the USS Guadalupe at the end of the summer. And was on it for approximately 2 years. And made, I think, 3 trips to Westpac, Western Pacific. And then at that time I was transferred to Naval Air Station, Atlantic City.
What was the purpose of the USS Guadalupe? Was it just a supply ship?
It supplied oil at sea to other ships. We would pull up alongside, say, a destroyer maybe, and pump oil from the Guadalupe over across to the destroyer. And we'd go on a fueling operation and maybe supply oil to maybe 8 or 10 ships over a 2 or 3 day period. And then we also acted as a sort of a supply ship in Taiwan, Subic Bay, Philippines, and also Japan. We were home base more or less out of Sasebo, Japan.
Did you ever get any liberty off of in the Pacific and get on any land in like Japan or
Hong Kong, Sasebo, Yokosuka, Kobe. Those are the places I remember.
What were they like at that time period? They're pretty sprawling cities now.
The good thing about most of those places was you were able to buy things very cheap at that time. I mean, a sailor would convert $100 into Japanese yen and live really high on the hog for quite a while. I mean, I remember you'd have a dinner with a bottle of wine and steak for $1. So it was quite nice. The sailors, to illustrate that, the sailors would skip Honolulu. They wouldn't even go ashore because it was so expensive. They saved their money till they got to Japan.
Do you have a favorite of the cities?
I guess I like to go on the shore at Sasebo. That's on the southern part of Japan. And they had a very nice bay harbor, and you could get from the Navy there, you could check out sailboats and sail around the harbor. And they had nice little fishing villages located around the harbor. So it was always nice to get off the ship and do a little sailing.
Do you have any, I guess, any individual trips that you remember above the others, or?
Hong Kong was always special. At that time, you could get anything you wanted in Hong Kong for a very cheap price. How about an engagement ring for my wife, but later to be my wife. And I bought a bunch of clothes. You get hand-tailored shirts for $3.
Did you over the 3 trips, did you know there was going to be a last trip when it was your 3rd trip? Could you have made a certain amount of points, or did you get back from the 3rd trip and they just said, we don't need you for any more runs?
It doesn't happen just like that. You just get orders in the mail that you'll be transferred to the Naval Air Station in Atlantic City. I spent 6 months usually on a trip to the Far East. Then I'd be back in Long Beach, California for 6 months. So we'd alternate operating out of Long Beach, California, or either one of the Far East ports.
What were your duties?
I was a supply officer on the ship, which meant all of the oil was under my custody, and all of the spare parts and the mess facilities, the ship's mess.
So you pretty much ran the show as far as what was going on the ship.
What?
You pretty much ran the show as far as what went on the ship.
As far as all supplies and repair parts and the ship's mess, but the deliverance of the oil was under the deck force. I didn't have any responsibility as far as, all I had to do was measure how much oil went across by measuring the depth in the tanks. Actually, you measure the void space from the top of the oil to the top of the tank.
You ever wish you stashed some of it away for a later day?
Well, I did splash some money away I saved enough money so that I was able to go back to school with no problem.
And you said when you went to the air station Atlantic City, what was your duties there? How long did that? You said it was 6 months.
I was the shipping officer. All stuff that came in or left the station, I was responsible for. And so when they decided to close the base up, they shipped everything off, so to speak. So that was a tremendous amount of work for me. And the other thing of consequence was there's where I got married. I got married to a girl from just outside of Atlantic City.
You said you bought the engagement ring in Hong Kong. How long had you been seeing her?
I just bought it as a goodbye. I didn't give it to, I wasn't going with her yet.
Mm-hmm.
I bought it as an investment.
It's pretty smart move.
It was pretty smart. I was trying to figure something to buy in Hong Kong that would be, that I could buy and make some money on. And jewelry in Hong Kong at that time was good buy. Jade was, I particularly liked jade. And I bought some jade also in addition to a diamond engagement ring. At that time I didn't know it was an engagement ring, it was just a diamond.
At the Atlantic station, was that your last duty? Was that your last?
Naval Air Station, yes. Well, it's a little bit different. I closed up the Naval Air Station in June, and my service was not to end till August, and so I was transferred to Lakehurst in temporary duty for 3 months.
What made you, had you already decided that when you got married that you were going to get out of the Navy, or was it before that, or was it, like, what time did you decide, I don't want to do this anymore?
Well, I considered very strongly as staying in the Navy. And my commanding supply officer at Naval Air Station tried to talk me into staying in the Navy. And I considered it very strongly, but I decided that I didn't like the idea of not being home-based, so to speak. You know, times have changed a good bit, but engineers at that time tended to work for a company for a long period of time and not transfer from one company to another. So that you could count on being stationed, if you were in industry, a lot longer period of time than like the Navy, where you'd be changing every couple of years. I like the idea of having a home base.
And so from that temporary assignment, you voluntarily chose to get your discharge papers and go back to Georgia?
Thomaston, Georgia. My father died my last 3 years, my last 3 days in the Navy. I got word that my father died of a heart attack. And so I went back, and I guess it's another whole story in a way. While I entered at Georgia Tech to finish up my program there, but I drove back and forth to Thomaston, Georgia, to settle my father's estate. And he owned a waterworks in addition to a fair number of houses that he rented in the black subdivision. So I closed up his estate and went back and forth to Georgia Tech till December. And my wife lived in Thomaston, Georgia while this was going on.
Did I guess what year would have this been when you were finally discharged?
I was finally discharged in 1958, I believe. 1958, I guess.
And then continued on to finish your master's, or had you already?
Yeah, I had done part of my work on my master's, remember, earlier. And so I started working on my master's. And then I passed the PhD exams, and so I started working on my PhD and master's, so to speak, at the same time. And
After completing them, did you want to go into a job, or did you want to go back into academia and teach?
well, I lived mostly by accidents. I was in the office of the chem engineering at Georgia Tech, and the head of the department saw me come in one day and said, "Are you interested in teaching?" And I said, "Well, I might be. Where is it?" He said, "A place called Clemson." And I said, "Well, I'm going to Philadelphia and I'm going to pass through there. I'll stop and take a look at it." So I stopped and took a look and met Dr. Littlejohn as head of the department. And I went back up in a week later and took the job teaching at Clemson.
What sold you on that little stop? What made you?
Well, I liked Dr. Littlejohn very much, but they had the need for a thermodynamicist, which was what I specialized in, thermodynamics. And so it was a good fit. And I liked the small town atmosphere, although it was a little bit too small at that time. And I had to talk my wife into wanting to live there. But it was an ideal fit for me because of my interest in thermodynamics.
So you would have picked up that job about 1960 or so, or 1961?
Well, I didn't come to Clemson until 1965, I guess it was. I started teaching in January 1965. See, I spent several years in research at the experiment station. That's where the extra years came in.
Down in Georgia. The research station, do you mean the?
The experiment station at Georgia Tech. It's attached to the university.
It wasn't the nuclear studies, was it? I remember at one point in time they had a nuclear reactor.
But mostly, I worked on several different areas. One being everything to do with cryogenic compounds, that is stuff that's down around absolute zero. We did work on helium, hydrogen, methane. I later did a fair amount of work in methane, and after I went to Clemson, I did some more work in cryogenic fluids, and I was very interested in energy conservation. I worked but in the summer I started working some in nuclear work at both the Savannah River project and also the Oak Ridge. it was the work it involved at Savannah River. It involved what to do with the waste in all of the tanks that they had stored waste products, because the tanks would eventually corrode and leak, and you had radioactive stuff coming out of the inner tank, and so what they had was an inner tank and an outer tank, and as soon as it leaked into the outer tank, they'd pump it into a new tank. So that was our scheme of preventing it from getting in the environment. So I worked on one aspect of that problem for one summer. Then I went to Oak Ridge and designed a computer program to solve a problem that related to high temperature gas cooled reactors, where they had radioactive krypton in a gaseous that they had to do something with, because the krypton is inert and doesn't react with anything. So the radioactive krypton was a problem, so I worked on designing a project that would remove the radioactive krypton from the off gases. There was only a small amount of krypton, but it's krypton being non-reactive with other compounds, you had to do some way of collecting it, and so I worked on that for 2 summers. So the other whole area that I was interested in my research was energy conservation, and in fact I'm very interested in what goes on in from the standpoint of global warming now. I was active in the Unitarian Church. We had some interest in looking at that problem while I was involved with the Unitarian Church recently.
Were you at Oak Ridge? Was the Cold War just getting into full swing when you were, I guess, in the 1960s? What was the security like at Oak Ridge National Laboratory?
They had tight security at both Savannah River and even more in Savannah River, I think, than at Oak Ridge. It was, you had to check in and check out with your car every day when you went in. But in fact, when I first went down to the Savannah River, I stayed outside the fence in a little house doing nothing but reading material for about a month until I got clearance. It was a pain in the rear.
Was there a big Red Scare going on then? A lot of anti-communist talk, or?
No, I didn't see much of that.
And so that was before 1965, before you went to Clemson, and then in the beginning of January 1965, you started teaching.
I started teaching in 1965. But I went to Savannah River pretty shortly after that.
Okay. What kind of research did you do at Clemson?
My research at Clemson involved a number of different applications of thermodynamics, and I have one of my earliest graduate students has been very active also studying properties of methane hydrate. You may have heard the fact that we have a tremendous amount of methane hydrates in the environment. In the bottoms of the oceans, it's filled with methane hydrate. And then also in the tundra, there's a lot of methane hydrate. Methane, if it decomposes when it warms up, then you got methane going off to the environment. Methane is even worse than CO2 in terms of causing global warming. And so that the properties of the methane hydrates has been studied extensively by one of my first graduate students, since he's at Colorado School of Mines now. And he's written a couple of books on the properties of methane hydrates and the various processes involving methane hydrate.
Sounds like an exponential problem. We warm up the earth and then the earth warms up even more by itself.
Oh yeah, definitely. Global warming is caused by the increase in the CO2. As a matter of fact, one thing I exhibited in one talk I gave is the CO2 has gone up every year since about early 1900s. But you can look at it as almost a direct correlation with the population of the Earth. And people today don't seem to be, they talk about curing global warming, but you don't hear any of them talking about birth control in relation to the fact that as long as you got more people, you're going to have more CO2. And the more CO2, you're going to get more global warming. So it's really a tragic thing that's happening to the Earth now, in my opinion.
What all, how long was your stay at Clemson? Did you get a tenure?
Oh, I was at Clemson. Well, you're talking about as a teacher?
Teacher or whatever?
Well, I was a teacher the whole time I was here. It was about 20, I think it was,
You held other positions amongst the university, though. You weren't just a professor.
well, I was a full professor the whole time. And after I retired, and I think it was 91, I got credit for, in terms of retirement, I got credit for teaching at Georgia Tech and also for my Navy time. So I had a total of 38 years toward retirement. But but my whole time at Clemson, I was a professor, or started off as an assistant professor, associate professor, and then full professor.
Now, you also held the position of the chairman of the university's internal investigations.
That was just a extra. Well, I was an assistant tennis coach for about 6 years.
Well, I want to hear about all of it, and whatever other positions you may have done other than teaching.
Served in addition as an assistant tennis coach. In fact, we won the first tennis championship in the ACC in 19 which year that was. It was 69, I believe it was, 1969. We won the ACC championship.
First time ever for Clemson?
Yeah. Dwayne Bruni was the head tennis coach. He was also a chem engineer. And then Bill Beckwith and I were assistants. At that time, all of the minor sports, considering tennis as a minor sport, all the minor coaching was done by professors. And at that point, in about 1971, I believe it was, that they started converting over to professional coaches. So I didn't qualify.
I'm sure winning the winning the ACC championship made him give a little bit of a push for the minor sports to get better coaches.
In my opinion, athletics at universities has gotten completely out of control. And at that time, Clemson operated like most others. The coaches in all of the minor sports were faculty members, or either half-time faculty members. But then things changed, and athletics has gotten completely out of control.
You thinking specifically our university or all universities? Or?
All universities in general. Now there's some that the Ivy Leagues are still apparently fairly under control. You don't see the Ivy League doing much in the way of NCAA championships or something like that. As a matter of fact, you point out, if you look in the rankings of universities and academics, and then compare the rankings in the football, for example, you find that Stanford is the only one that's in the top 20 in both. None of the other top 20 academic schools are anywhere in the top 20 in football. So that I think that it's gotten completely out of control. As a matter of fact, Jim Barker is the chairman. He was chairman of the committee to change the rules in the NCAA. And I guess he won't be able to carry out his. I don't think he finished it.
He's still in recovery at this time. He could be up and running in a month or so, or he could turn it over. It's just up to him. It's however long it takes him to recover from the the quintuple bypass surgery.
Yeah.
But you said you knew both. You knew Dr. Littlejohn. What was your obviously now we have a basketball coliseum named after him.
No, it's not named after him.
No, excuse me. I mean, yeah, Dr. Littlejohn.
He was the head of the chem engineering, Charlie Littlejohn, and his wife is out here at the Downs, Doris Littlejohn. But the Littlejohn that the stadium is named after is I think it was his uncle. It was a relative.
What about any other, you said, did you know President Barker before he was president?
When I was president of the faculty senate, See, I was president of faculty senate for a year. I served on a dean's council with him, and his son was also a good tennis player. So he's interested in tennis and comes to watch a lot of the matches, even now, or even like last year. You'd see him at the tennis court watching the matches. And so I would sometimes sit with him.
What about your anything interesting you did while you were the head of the faculty senate or president of the faculty senate?
Nothing that I think was too important. It was Mack came aboard while I was president of the faculty senate, and this made an effect when I was appointed as, I guess it was about a year later, I was appointed chairman of this committee that investigated the NCAA violations.
Can you talk about what those violations were?
Everything was kept confidential pretty much, but and I hate to say too much, but the internal committee at the university was the idea when I was appointed as chairman was that we would look at all the violations that might have occurred on campus, so to speak, and work with the NCAA committee that was doing the investigation for the NCAA. But they were not interested in what we were doing at all. In fact, it was like two separate, completely independent committees that didn't talk to each other. And so that the on-campus work that we did not have any effect, basically, on the investigation of the NCAA. That's about all I could say.
And that would have been about, you retired in 91, that would have been 89 or so when that happened?
What year was that? That's about right.
So you were assistant tennis coach, president of the faculty senate, chairman of this board. Is there any other, I guess, anything else that you did at Clemson that stands out to you, or?
Well, the teaching itself was the biggest part. I mean, I always had a full load of teaching.
You enjoy it?
And I enjoyed the teaching very much. And I had, I don't remember how many graduate students I had. I think maybe in the neighborhood of, say, 25. And I enjoyed working with the graduate students very much.
Well, as far as stayed at Clemson, what about, I guess, just at that time, things as far as, I hear, do you remember, I guess, where you were when you first heard Kennedy was assassinated, as far as recapping major events?
I was at Georgia Tech, working for the experiment station when that happened. I remember exactly where I was when I first learned of it. I was in the experiment station working on a computer, I say big computer. It was a little by today's computers, but
Yeah, they're moving on to one of the biggest supercomputers in the world. Yeah. You were working on the program, and what did you think when you heard it?
To be completely honest, I mean, I was shocked, but I was not a big Kennedy supporter as far as that goes, and so, but I was certainly shocked and sorry that it happened, but I did not think it would have a big effect on the country. I thought that the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, would take over, which he did, of course, and as a matter of fact, if you look at the things that were done to promote equality between races and so forth, Lyndon Johnson did more than Kennedy did, in my opinion.
Well, considering your line of work, where were you when the Cuban Missile Crisis was happening? Were you at a sensitive location, or?
I was trying to remember where I was when that happened. Of course, I was really very concerned about it. As a matter of fact, my stepfather put underground an old railroad car. He was only about a mile from the railroad that ran from Thomaston, Georgia, up through Barnesville. And he was concerned enough that he bought a surplus railroad car and put it underground on a piece of his property where he had a small lake. That was my stepfather. My father had died earlier, and my mother married my father's best friend. So he was concerned, certainly, enough to put a railroad car underground. It's still there.
You know where it is in case things get a little ugly? You know how to find it still?
Oh yeah, I know exactly where it is.
As far as, but you don't remember specifically where you were, or?
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it wasn't one sharp point in time. I think it occurred over several weeks, didn't it?
Yes.
So, I mean, it was not something that I would remember a particular time and associate it with.
The same thing as you would with Kennedy's assassination, yes.
Yeah.
This is, any other elections that stand out to you, or the Berlin Wall?
As a matter of fact, I was at the Berlin Wall just about the time I was there. Within 3 days after it happened, I guess, and I walked through across the Berlin Wall. So I was visiting Germany, and I was visiting Freiburg, and then I wanted to see Berlin. I wanted to go up and see Berlin, and I went up there and walked through the Berlin Wall. I was trying to remember exactly. But anyway, I did go through the Berlin Wall about the time
Grab any concrete?
No, I wish I had.
Did you have any idea when you were planning your trip to Germany or in Germany that was about to happen, or what was?
No, I didn't know it was going to happen while I was over there. I had been across into Czechoslovakia. I attended a conference that was being held in Czechoslovakia. So I went through crossing the Czechoslovakia. But you can get across. I mean, you just had to have passes and all. And I had a legitimate pass, so I was able to get across. But later, I walked across where the wall was to see what changes had occurred.
Were Germans very positive toward Americans at that point in time?
Well, they were very positive toward Americans, the ones that I knew through academia, but I don't know. It was interesting, right next to the wall, a little bit away from the concrete wall, but a little bit further down where it was just wire. There were little villages of people that would live right next to the wire, and they were drunk all the time. I just did one of those.
Well, what about, just considering all you've seen in the past couple of years, what are your thoughts on any events in the past few years, or any of the wars or any conflicts? And like you said, do you think academia, as far as sports go, they've gotten out of control?
I'm afraid that as long as the religions of the world is different in what is a right in, like, say, a woman's right to drive a car, as you well as know, is always given as an example. Like you got Saudi Arabia or someplace where they can't drive, or they have so many restrictions on females getting educated or whatever. There's so much difference between our system and the world's, a lot of the places in the world, that I can't see that the conflicts are going to be solved easily. They're not going to be solved, period. They have a whole different. And one thing about being old, like I am, is I went through a lot of the changes in this country. Back when I was a kid, I went to all white schools, and but yet I've seen the changes that have occurred, that have improved so much. But if you compare that with some of the countries like Afghanistan or any of these places, their concepts are worse than they were in this country in the 1900s, early 1900s, which, and I grew up in the South and long enough ago that I saw the inequalities that were in this country, and yet that's so far ahead of the rest of the world that it's hard for me to believe that it's going to be any positive change. It seems to get worse. And there's so much corruption that you can't even give money and expect it to end up doing any good. I'd like to see the percent of the money that just goes to the corrupt politicians and so forth in these countries that it's hardly worth giving money to. I give money to things that I can see the results, like Habitat for Humanity or something like that. I see that it's being used properly. If I gave it to some country in Africa, you know that it's likely to be less than 10% of it ever getting to where it's being used.
Well, on a positive note, going back to Clemson, were you on campus when Harvey Nant was his first day?
That occurred just about a year before I got there, I believe. I was advisor for the first black athlete, but he transferred. He was recruited by Tate's Lock, and he transferred from chem engineering to chemistry after the first year. So I didn't really have much to do with him, but it was the first black athlete.
Remember his name or?
You know, I was trying to remember that the other day. I can't think of his name right now.
Well, what about the sport?
He was recruited for basketball, but he never played.
Focused on his grades.
No, I think he just wasn't. Well, they recruited him because he had decent grades, apparently, but then he didn't really do well in basketball.
Is there, as far as watching Clemson grow up, you obviously decided to stay in Clemson. Is there anything about Clemson in particular you find you could describe what really makes Clemson special, the reason you stayed here for so long?
Well, I think the thing that attracted me as much as anything was something that we haven't talked about, is after coaching tennis, I started doing a lot of teaching of kids for nothing. I didn't get paid for it. I just gave free lessons. And so I've probably given lessons to maybe like a couple of hundred kids. Some of them have done quite well. Had a couple of them get scholarships. My son was a good young player. He gave it up, but he was a state champion in 12 and unders. And then that was during the Vietnam War, and the kids were kind of rebellious. But anyway, I've taught a lot of kids tennis, and so I always enjoyed that as my hobby. And in fact, I was a state champion also in the 40 and over classification. So what I like to do is, for a hobby, was being involved with tennis. And Clemson was a good place. We had good facilities, pretty good. And kids didn't live so far away from the courts. So that's what I miss most of all now, is in the last 2 years I've had to quit. I taught up until about 2 years ago. So that was a pretty long time.
Sounds like you might have taught a couple more than a couple hundred. Sounds like you might have.
I don't know how many, but I worked with the high school teams a good bit. But I was never the high school coach. But you had to be associated with the high school. But usually they didn't even know what a tennis racket was, and so I would end up doing a lot of the teaching.
Well,
Well, you should know everything about me by now.
just about, I hope so. I don't know, it seems like we always turn off the camera and somebody remembers one more story. Yes. Looking back, I guess would you say on your we started out with your service, how do you think your service affected the rest of your life?
I always seemed to do something that I had no idea that I was going to do it. Like when I came to Clemson, it just happened to be that the head of the department at Georgia Tech asked me if I was interested in teaching. I've never made a decision based on looking at a long time ahead saying that I want to do so and so. When I graduate, I want to go so and so. There's always decisions made almost on the spur of the moment. That everyone that I've been involved in has been just a spur of the moment. So it's hard to say. If things had been different, I would have made a different choice, I guess.
It looks like it worked out pretty well for you.
Yeah, I've had a lot of varied things that I've done. And I think it's nice to not do the same thing for all of your life.
Well, I can't thank you enough for letting us do this interview. And
Well, I'm not sure
there was plenty, and thank you once again for your service and for your years dedicated to Clemson.